June Hartley's hand froze on the doorbell when she looked down and saw what the grey cat was holding. Not another button, not another receipt. A blue medical alert bracelet, its metal plate turned face up in the frost-white morning light, 3 engraved lines catching the pale sun. Walter Ingram, heart condition, contact in emergency. The cat dropped it onto the toe of June's boot and did not look away from Walt's silent front door. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from and hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story like this one. June's coffee had gone cold in her hand a half-hour earlier, back when she was standing at her kitchen sink, watching the frost creep across her lawn. That first Tuesday in October had come with a wind that smelled like wood smoke, and June had been thinking, without really wanting to, about how much she still hated Tuesdays. Her husband, Frank, had died on a Tuesday, 4 years and 2 months ago now, sitting in the recliner in their front room, with the crossword still open on his lap. Tuesdays got heavier every year, and no one had told her they would. She had turned from the sink and seen a grey cat sitting perfectly still on her welcome mat, tail wrapped neat around her paws, staring at the door as if she had an appointment. When June opened it, the cat did not run. She lifted one front paw and revealed what she'd been guarding. A small brown button, the kind that came off an old man's coat, still hanging by one broken thread. June had crouched down. The cat let her pick it up. It was warm, oddly, from having been carried in the cat's mouth. June looked across the low picket fence at Walt Ingram's blue house and figured Walt must have dropped it somewhere in the yard, the way old men drop things and never notice. She slipped the button into the pocket of her cardigan, and she said softly, "Well, aren't you a peculiar little visitor?" The cat had blinked slow at her once, then jumped down and crossed the frost-crisp grass and disappeared under Walt's porch. June had not thought about the button again for 7 days. Then the following Tuesday, in the exact same spot, the cat was back. This time she brought a folded pharmacy receipt. June had unfolded it slowly on her kitchen table, her reading glasses down at the tip of her nose. It was a small square of paper, one of those receipts with the medication codes and the little privacy warning at the bottom, and printed at the top in faded black ink was the name W. Ingram. 2 medications had been filled that day, and next to a third, the printer had marked the word declined, with a handwritten note underneath in a pharmacist's neat hand that said, "Patient requested 1 prescription at a time due to cost." June sat for a long minute holding that receipt. She thought about Walt in his blue house, the way she saw him some evenings shuffling out to the mailbox in a coat that hung too loose on his shoulders now, the way he always waved when she waved, but never came over the way he had when Doris was still alive. She thought about the button and about how thin he had looked in September, and she folded the receipt back up, put on her boots, and walked next door. Walt answered on the 3rd knock. He was wearing a plaid flannel shirt tucked into brown corduroy trousers, and his grey hair was combed neat. He smiled, wide and quick, when he saw her. "Well, hello there, June Bug," he said. "Long time no see." His voice sounded thinner than she remembered. She held up the receipt. "Your cat brought me this," she said, half laughing at how ridiculous it sounded when she said it out loud. "And a button, last week." Walt looked at the receipt for a moment, and then he waved a hand as if he were brushing away a fly. "Oh, that's just Biscuit," he said. "Doris named her. She's always been peculiar, dragging things around, hoarding, dropping stuff wherever the notion takes her. Doris used to say Biscuit thought she was human. I'll take that from you." He held out his hand. June did not give him the receipt right away. "Are you all right, Walt?" she asked. He blinked at her, and for the smallest fraction of a second she saw something else in his eyes, something tired and hollow and afraid, and then it was gone. "Right as rain," he said. "Right as rain, June Bug." And he took the receipt from her hand and stepped back and closed the door softly, and June stood on the porch in the wind, with her hands in her pockets and the feeling in her chest that something was not right at all. She walked back home slowly. Her breath made small white clouds in the cold. On her own porch, she stopped and she turned around, and she looked at Walt's house. The blinds in the front window twitched just once. That was the second week. The third week, the cat brought a photograph. It was laminated, curled slightly at the corners as if it had lived a long time in a shirt pocket. On the front was a woman standing in front of a great blue lake with mountains behind her. She was wearing a red sweater and her hair was blowing across her face, and she was laughing. On the back, in soft pencil, in what June recognized as Walt's slanted, careful hand, someone had written the words Doris, Lake Tahoe, 1987. June stood in her doorway holding that photograph while Biscuit sat on the mat and watched her, and she thought about that word peculiar, because a cat does not peculiar her way through a house and select week after week one small object at a time, and carry it out into the cold and lay it at another woman's door. A cat that hoards does not deliver. A cat that hoards keeps. June went inside and put the photograph in a small, clear plastic sandwich bag, and she put it in the top drawer of her hall table next to the button and the receipt. And she watched Walt's house all afternoon. Walt did not come out that day. He did not come out the day after. On the third day, she saw the mailman leave 2 envelopes wedged in his box, and the mail sat there overnight. And the next morning, when she walked past to get her paper, it was still there. She almost went over, she almost knocked, but she remembered his face, the flash of it, the shame in it when she had asked if he was all right, and she thought about a proud man and about how you cannot help a proud man by shaming him further. So she went home, and she watched. The fourth week, Biscuit brought the lid of a pill organizer. Not the whole organizer, just the small, clear plastic lid with the letters printed on it. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. The little hinges were snapped, as if someone had pried the lid off in a hurry or in frustration. June stood in her kitchen with the lid in her palm, and she felt her hands begin to shake very slightly, the way they did when she stood too fast, and she made herself breathe. Because now she was starting to understand what she was being told. The cat was reporting. The cat was reporting on a man who could not or would not ask for help. She lined the objects up on the table: button, receipt, photograph, lid. She looked at them the way you look at pieces of a puzzle when you have not yet found the corner, and she waited for the 5th week. Biscuit did not disappoint her. The 5th week, on a Wednesday morning instead of a Tuesday, the cat brought a small brass key. It had a red plastic grip that had been chewed on at one end, either by the cat or by a much younger version of the cat, and the metal of it was worn smooth from years in a pocket. June looked at that key for a long time. Then she looked out her window at Walt's house. The blinds had not moved in 3 days. Newspapers had piled up on the front porch. 2 of them, then 3. There had been a small snow flurry the night before, and it had stuck in a thin white crust on top of the newspapers, undisturbed. No one had walked out to get them. June's phone rang, and she jumped as if she had been shot. It was her daughter, Katie, calling from Denver like she did every Sunday, and sometimes on Wednesdays if she was worried about her mother. June let it ring. She was watching the crust of snow on Walt's newspapers, and she was thinking about the key in her hand, and she was thinking that if this cat had been trying to tell her something for 5 weeks, and she had been slow to listen, well, she was going to listen now. She put on her coat. She put on her boots, she put the key in her right pocket, and she walked out into the cold. Biscuit was already at Walt's front door, sitting exactly where she had sat on that first Tuesday in October, tail wrapped neat around her paws, staring at the wood. Only this time, when June looked down, Biscuit was holding one more thing in her mouth. A blue medical alert bracelet. Walter Ingram. Heart condition. Contact in emergency. June did not knock this time. She did not call out. She dropped to her knees on Walt's frozen welcome mat, and she took out her cell phone with a hand that did not quite feel like her own, and she dialed 911, and while the operator answered, she was already pulling the brass key from her pocket and sliding it into Walt's front lock. It turned like it had been waiting for her. The door swung open into a house that smelled like cold coffee and dust, and something faint and sour that June would later understand was fear. "Walt!" she called. "Walt, it's June! I'm coming in!" And Biscuit shot through her legs and disappeared down the hall toward the kitchen, and June followed her, and there in the doorway of a small yellow-tiled kitchen she saw him. Walt was on the floor. His head was propped up against the cabinet under the sink, and his eyes were open, and his right leg was bent in a way that a leg is not supposed to bend. There was a broken coffee cup near his hand, and a puddle of coffee, long dry now, on the tile beside him. He looked at her and his mouth trembled, and he said in a voice that was small and hoarse, and had not spoken to anyone in a very long time, "June. Oh, Junebug." I fell. She got down on the floor next to him and she took his cold hand in both of hers. "When?" she said. He did not answer right away. "Last night," he said finally. "I think." It was still dark. I was reaching for my pills. Then he closed his eyes and a single tear ran into his grey stubble, and he said, "I couldn't get up. I couldn't get to the phone." And I thought, well, I thought this was how it was going to end. And I was mad about it, June. Not scared, just mad. Biscuit had settled down in the crook of his good arm, and she was purring. And Walt lifted his other hand very slowly and put it on her back, and he said, "And then this fool cat kept climbing on me and yowling at me and running to the door, and I thought she'd lost her mind." He looked at June. He looked at the bracelet still clenched in Biscuit's teeth, dropped now beside his hip. He looked at the door. "You came," he said. The paramedics arrived 4 minutes later. 2 young men in navy jackets came through the door with a stretcher and gentle hands, and one of them, the taller one, whose name tag said Ramirez, knelt down beside Walt and said, "Sir, we've got you now. We've got you," and Walt held onto June's hand tighter than she thought he was able to, and would not let go while they slid the board under him. When they lifted him, he cried out once, softly, like a child who is trying not to. The other paramedic, the shorter one whose name tag said Hollins, took June aside as they were wheeling Walt out through the front door. He said, "Ma'am, was he like this when you got here?" She nodded. "Since when?" he asked. She told him about the bracelet, about the newspapers, about her guess that it had been at least 18 hours. He whistled low. "Ma'am," he said, "another 12 hours on that floor at his age, in that cold, and we would have been calling a coroner. You saved his life." June did not know what to say to that. She said, "Thank you." She said, "I'll follow you to the hospital." She said, "Is that his cat?" The paramedic looked over at Biscuit, who was sitting now in the exact center of the kitchen doorway watching them. He smiled, tired. "That's a good cat, ma'am," he said. "That's a really, really good cat." June closed Walt's door behind them. She could not lock it, she did not know how, so she just pulled it shut. Biscuit had followed her out. On the porch, the cat sat down at her feet and looked up at her, and June bent down and picked her up, and Biscuit did not fight her, which somehow undid something in June's chest that had been holding tight since her husband died 4 years ago. She carried the cat back to her own house and put her down on the kitchen floor next to a saucer of milk, and then she got in her car and drove 22 miles to the county hospital. At the hospital, they had put Walt in a bed by the window on the 4th floor. His hip was fractured in 2 places. He would need surgery in the morning. They had also, the nurse told June in the hallway quietly, found that he was significantly undernourished, dehydrated, and had missed at least a week of his blood pressure medication and, they thought, several months of his cardiac medication. The nurse's name was Angela. Her eyes were kind. She said, "Ma'am, is there anyone we should call family, maybe?" June said, "I'll find out." She sat down beside Walt's bed. He was under a thin cotton blanket, and his hair had been combed down flat by someone in a hurry, and he looked smaller than he had ever looked next door. She held his hand, and she told him quietly what Biscuit had been doing for 5 weeks. She took the button from her cardigan pocket and the receipt from her purse, and she talked him through them, one at a time, and she watched his face change. He was quiet for a long time when she finished. He looked out the window at the parking lot and the sodium lights coming on in the dusk. Then he said, "Very slow, June. I have not told a living soul, but I have been falling for maybe 3 months now. Little falls at first. I'd catch the counter, catch the door frame, then a hard one in the bathroom in August, cracked the tile with my elbow. I was afraid, June, that if I told anyone, my son would put me somewhere. And I would rather die on that kitchen floor. Do you understand me? I would rather die on that kitchen floor than get put somewhere." "Yes," June said quietly, "I understand you." He looked at her. There was something behind his eyes that she had not seen in almost a decade of living next door to him. Not since the day of Doris's funeral, when he had stood at the graveside in a black suit with his hat over his heart and had not moved for 20 minutes after the last mourner walked away. "And I did not know," he said. "I did not know the cat had noticed. I did not know a cat could notice. Doris said she noticed everything. I thought that was Doris." June felt her own eyes fill. "Doris was right," she said. "The nurse came back with a form. Would he like her to call his emergency contact?" Walt looked at the form and looked away. He said, "My son. His name is David. I have not spoken to my son in 19 months, but he is who is on that bracelet." June said, "Do you want him called?" Walt closed his eyes. He said, "Might as well." June wrote out David Ingram's phone number from Walt's dictation, and the nurse took the form away, and Walt turned his head to the window and did not speak again for a while. Then he said softly, "Junebug, would you go check on Biscuit for me?" She said, "Of course, Walt." He said, "And would you leave the porch light on?" She said, "I will." And she drove home in the dark, thinking about that word, "put me," and about a proud man on a kitchen floor for 18 hours, and about a cat who had been building a case for 5 weeks and had not stopped until someone listened. That would have been the end of it, or maybe the beginning of a quieter ending, if David Ingram had not walked into that hospital room the next afternoon carrying an envelope. Because that is where the second half of this story starts, and it is not the half June expected. He was tall like his father, but sharper somehow, the way an axe is sharp compared to a hammer. He came into the hospital lobby on a Thursday afternoon in a charcoal wool coat that looked like it had never seen a snowbank, and when he stepped up to the reception desk, June, who had been sitting in a plastic chair reading last month's magazines, knew immediately who he was. He had Walt's cheekbones and Walt's jaw, and none of Walt's stillness. He said, "My name is David Ingram. I'm here to see my father, Walter Ingram." And the receptionist gave him a badge and pointed him to the 4th floor elevators. And June stood up and followed him. She caught him in the elevator. She said, "Mr. Ingram, I'm June Hartley. I'm your father's neighbor. I'm the one who found him." He looked at her. "The way you look at a form you have to sign." He said, "Yes, the hospital mentioned you. Thank you very much for what you did." The elevator moved. He looked at the panel. He did not look at her. She said, "He's asleep right now. They gave him something for the pain after surgery." She said, "He's been very worried about the call." She said softly, "He told me you two hadn't spoken in a while." David Ingram looked at her then. His eyes were the same washed-out blue as Walt's, and he was not unkind, only very, very tired in a way she recognized. He said, "Ma'am, I appreciate everything you've done. I really do. But we're going to take it from here. My father is going to need placement, long-term care. It's been coming for a while, and now we have a natural moment for it, and it will be easier on everyone if we don't make it complicated. Placement, June said. Yes, ma'am. The elevator doors opened. He stepped out. June stayed where she was for a second, and then she stepped out too, and she said, Mr. Ingram, may I ask you something? He turned. Yes, he said. She said, when was the last time you were in your father's house? He blinked at her. He said, a while. She said, I only ask because your father is not confused. He is not incapable. He fell. People fall. My mother fell twice and lived to 89 at her own kitchen table. What your father needs, sir, is help. Some help. A rail in the bathroom. Somebody stopping by. He does not need placement. David Ingram looked at her and he took a very small breath and he said, Ma'am, with respect, you don't know what I know about my father. He turned and walked down the hall to Walt's room, and he did not look back. June stood in the hall for a while. She did not follow him in. Then she went down to the cafeteria and got a coffee she did not drink, and she sat by a window and watched a bird pecking at something in the snow, and she thought. When she came back upstairs 2 hours later, David Ingram was not in Walt's room. Walt was awake. The blanket was pulled up under his chin, and he was looking at the ceiling. On the tray table next to his bed was a slim manila folder, and June, without asking, opened it. Inside was a durable power of attorney form, and next to it a voluntary placement agreement for a facility called Ashwood Manor Assisted Living, and beside that, a printed listing for Walt's house from a realty company called Meridian Property Group, with a suggested asking price of $482,000. Walt was not looking at the folder. He was looking at the ceiling. Did you sign anything? June asked quietly. He shook his head just once. Did he ask you to? He said we could talk about it in the morning. He said I don't have to decide today. He said he's staying at the Marriott downtown for 3 nights. June sat down beside Walt's bed and closed the folder. She said, Walt, do you want to sell your house? Walt shook his head again. She said, do you want to go to Ashwood Manor? He shook his head a 3rd time, harder. She said, then we are not selling your house, and you are not going to Ashwood Manor. We are getting you home. Do you hear me? We are getting you home. Walt looked at her. His eyes were wet. Junebug, he said, David is my son. He said it like a fact he had been carrying for a long time and could not put down. Yes, June said, and you are his father, and he is a grown man, but he does not get to hand you over to strangers because it is convenient for him. He does not. Walt closed his eyes. He said, ask him about the house. Ask him why now. There is something I do not know, but I think you might find out. She said, I will. He fell asleep holding her hand. That night June went home and fed Biscuit, who was waiting for her on the porch as if she had never lived anywhere else. And she sat at her own kitchen table with the folder in front of her, and she read the top page again and again until the letters swam. Meridian Property Group, $482,000. She turned it over. On the back, in small print, there was a note stapled that read, buyer already secured, contingent upon vacant possession. She stared at that phrase, vacant possession, as if Walt were a couch that had to be removed before the buyers moved in. She looked at Biscuit, who was on the counter eating tuna off a saucer with the delicate seriousness of an ambassador at a dinner. She said out loud, what am I missing? She did not sleep well. At 6 in the morning, she walked over to Walt's house with the brass key. She turned on lights. She opened the blinds. She stood in the living room and she looked around, slowly, at a house she had never really been in before. Doris's china cabinet still stood in the dining room, with the plates still lined up neat. Doris's watercolor of the covered bridge over the Battenkill was still on the wall above the sofa. On the mantel there was a small framed picture of a young man, 20 maybe, in a graduation cap holding a diploma. She picked it up. On the back, in pencil, Walt's slanted, careful hand had written, "David Middlebury, 1996. She put the picture back. She started without really meaning to in the kitchen. Biscuit trotted after her. She opened Walt's cabinets. She opened his fridge. There was a half-gallon of milk 2 weeks past its date, a stick of butter, 3 eggs, and a heel of white bread. There were 4 cans of tomato soup and a jar of instant coffee. That was all. She opened the pantry. Nothing much. She opened the drawer next to the sink and found a stack of bills held together with a black binder clip. She took the whole stack to the kitchen table and sat down. She read them. She read them all. Walt was 78 years old. His only income was Social Security. His mortgage on this house had been paid off in 1998. His property taxes were $900 a quarter. His heat, his water, his electric, none of it was extravagant. On paper, a man in Walt's situation should have been able to fill a fridge. And then, near the bottom of the stack, she found a monthly statement from Green Mountain Regional Hospital that was addressed to Walter Ingram and made her set her coffee cup down very carefully. It was a payment plan, 6 years old. The principal amount was $79,412. It was for medical expenses in the name of Doris Ingram, and the balance owed, after 6 years of monthly payments of $820 each, was still $42,311. June sat back in the chair. She read it again. Doris had died 3.5 years ago. Doris had been sick for 2 years before that, with the kind of cancer that eats through savings the way it eats through the body. Walt, June knew, had been retired from the Vermont Public Works Department since he was 62. Walt, on Social Security, was paying $980-something a month toward Doris's old hospital bill and had been doing so for 6 years. The reason Walt could not afford his heart medication was written right in front of her. The reason Walt was skipping meals was written right in front of her. The reason Walt was starving to pay off a woman who had been dead for 3.5 years was written right in front of her, and it was, of course, exactly the reason a man like Walt would, because Doris had asked him to promise, most likely, or because he had promised without her asking, because that was the man he was. June closed her eyes. The doorbell rang. She jumped so hard, she knocked over the coffee cup, and it made a small brown puddle on Walt's kitchen tile that looked, for one bad second, exactly like the puddle by his hand on the day she had found him. Biscuit was already at the door. June walked slowly into the hallway. Through the frosted panel beside the door, she could see a shape. 2 shapes, small, a woman and a child. She opened the door. On the front step stood a young woman in her early 20s, brown hair pulled back, a red knit hat, and a boy of maybe 4 holding her hand. The young woman had wide, surprised eyes when she saw June, and she said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I was looking for Walter Ingram. I heard he was in the hospital." June said, "I'm his neighbor. He is in the hospital. Who are you?" The young woman said, "My name is Kelsey Doyle. He probably doesn't know me by name, but I'd know him anywhere. My mom told me. He paid for my books, all 4 years at Castleton." June stared at her. Kelsey shifted her feet. She said, "I know it sounds strange to just show up. I heard about the fall at the diner this morning. My mom used to work at the plant when Mr. Ingram was the maintenance supervisor. When my mom got laid off in the fall of 2009, we lost the house. I was 13. Mr. Ingram used to slip envelopes into our mailbox. Anonymous, just cash, enough to keep the lights on. And when I was starting college 3 years ago, Mom finally figured out who it was, from the handwriting on the envelope. And I sent him a thank you card, and he wrote back saying, 'Please don't thank me, and please don't tell anyone.' So, I didn't. But I heard about the fall, and I brought him some soup." She held up a plastic container, and I wanted to see if he was okay. June did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Come inside, Kelsey, please. Sit down. I need to ask you some things." Kelsey and her son came into Walt's kitchen. June poured a glass of milk for the boy, whose name was Grady, and put the container of soup in Walt's empty fridge, and sat down across from Kelsey Doyle at the kitchen table with the payment plan and the stack of bills between them. And she said, "Kelsey, how much did Walt Ingram give your mother, do you know?" Kelsey looked at the bills. She said, "Over the years, maybe $7,000 or $8,000. Do you know anyone else he did this for?" Kelsey nodded slowly. She said, "My mom always said there were others. There was a family on Elm Street whose son was in a wheelchair. She said Walt paid for the ramp. And there was a woman named Marlene who cleaned houses, who lost her husband right around when Miss Doris died, and Walt paid her rent for 4 months. My mom said Walt used to say that money you keep past what you need is money someone else is dying without." June looked down at the payment plan for Doris Ingram's hospital bill, $42,311. She looked at Kelsey. She said, "Does anyone in this town know these things about Walt Ingram?" Kelsey shook her head. "He never wanted them to. My mom told me because I asked her once why she cried when she saw him at the grocery store. She said, 'Mom, I got the sense that everyone Walt Ingram helped, he made a point of never telling. He said charity that has a name attached to it is not charity, it's an advertisement.' My mom taught me that sentence." June sat back in the chair. She thought about David Ingram in his charcoal wool coat and the folder on the tray table and the words "vacant possession." And she thought about Walt on the kitchen floor for 18 hours because he could not afford both his hip and his heart at the same time. And she thought, all right, she said, "Kelsey, would you be willing to say all of this to a lawyer?" Kelsey nodded once without hesitation. She said, "Ma'am, I would say it to a judge." June closed the door behind Kelsey and Grady an hour later and stood alone in Walt's front room. She looked at the picture of David on the mantel again. She thought about a boy in a graduation cap and the man who had put himself between his son and every hardship a father can absorb, and how that man was now being handed a placement agreement by that same son. And she thought, no, that is not going to happen, not while I am on this block. She called her lawyer, a woman named Priscilla Hollins, who had handled Frank's estate and who owed June exactly one favor. Priscilla listened without interrupting for almost 20 minutes, and when June finished, Priscilla said, "Well, June, this is not really my area, but let me tell you a couple of things." She said, "First, unless your neighbor is legally incapacitated, and it sounds like he is not, his son cannot put him anywhere without his signature. Second, if there is a buyer already lined up for the house, and if that buyer is who I think it might be, this may be less about your neighbor and more about the block he lives on." She said, "June, do you know a company called Meridian Property Group?" June said, "I read the name on a listing." Priscilla said, "They've been buying up quiet little streets like yours all through Bennington County for the last 2 years. They are a shell company. The actual buyer, from what I've heard, is a developer out of Boston that is planning a 120-unit condominium complex, and they need 7 contiguous parcels to make it work." June said, "Priscilla." Priscilla said, "I know." June said, "My street has 7 houses." Priscilla said, "June, that is why they need Walt out, and that is why they are working through the sun." June sat down on Walt's stairs. Biscuit came and sat on the step above her and put a paw on her shoulder. That was the first time the cat had ever touched her that way. June put a hand on the paw and did not move for a long moment. She said, "Priscilla, what do we do?" Priscilla said, "First, do not sign anything on Walt's behalf, even if the son asks. Second, put in writing that Walt does not consent to any transaction and give it to me by tomorrow morning. Third, and this is the part you are not going to like, we need to slow this down until Walt is out of the hospital, because a man in a hospital bed on pain medication is a man they will pressure. And fourth, you need to talk to the other people on that street. Because if Meridian has been buying up the block, some of them have already sold. June went home and stood in the middle of her living room. Frank's recliner was still there, in the corner by the window. She had never gotten rid of it. She looked at it, and she said out loud, "Well, Frank, here we go." By noon that Friday, she had knocked on the door of every house on the block. Number 12 at the corner was empty. The Wallaces had sold in August. Number 14 was empty. The Ryersons had sold in October. Number 16 was June's house. Number 18 was Walt's. Number 20 was the Ortons, and Mrs. Orton answered the door in a bathrobe and said, "Oh, honey, we signed the paperwork last week. It's a lot of money, June. My husband is retiring in March. We are going to Florida." Number 22 at the other corner was the Kim family. Anna Kim came to the door and June explained what she knew. And Anna Kim's face went very still and she said, "Mom, we have not signed yet, but we were going to on Monday. We have 3 girls and the school district is better in Colchester, and we thought why not. Mom, did you say 120 condominiums?" June nodded. Anna Kim said, "Come inside. Let me call my husband." By 4 in the afternoon on Friday, all 4 of the remaining owners on Prospect Lane were sitting in June's kitchen with cups of coffee. Anna and Michael Kim, June herself, and the Kellys, whom June had barely spoken to in 8 years, an older couple who kept mostly to themselves and who had also been about to sign. And the 6 of them, over that pot of coffee, agreed to hold. Not one more parcel would go to Meridian. Not until Walt Ingram was out of the hospital and on his feet, and not without Walt Ingram at the table. Anna Kim said, "Mom, does Mr. Ingram know his son is trying to sell his house?" June said he suspects. Anna Kim said, "Well, he needs to know." June went to the hospital that evening. Walt was sitting up in bed, and his hair had been washed and the color was better in his face. David Ingram was in the guest chair. Both of them looked up when she came in. "David said, 'Mrs. Hartley, I was hoping to talk to you,'" June said, "and I to you." Walt looked between them. He said, "Whatever it is, say it in front of me. This is my room." June sat down on the far side of the bed. She put her hand on top of Walt's hand. She looked at David. She said, "David, I need to ask you a question, and I need you to answer it honest. Are you selling your father's house to Meridian Property Group?" David's jaw did something small. He said, "Mom, that is a family matter." She said, "David, it stopped being a family matter when it became a matter of a 120-unit condominium complex on my street. It stopped being a family matter when they went shopping for old people up and down Prospect Lane, and Mrs. Wallace and Mrs. Ryerson and Mrs. Orton all signed because they did not know they were being played. Is that who you are selling to?" Walt's hand under hers had gone very tight. David looked at his father, then he looked at June. He said, "No, I am not selling to Meridian. I am selling to a family, a private family from Burlington." June reached into her coat and took out her phone and slid it across the tray table toward him with a page open. It was the Meridian listing. It said, "Buyer already secured, contingent upon vacant possession." David went pale. Walt said quietly, "David, look at me." David looked at his father. Walt said, "David Michael Ingram, are you lying to me?" David said, "Dad, I did not know. I swear to God I did not know. I listed with an agent named Terence Booth out of Rutland. He told me a family. He said Burlington. I believed him." Walt said, "Does this agent work for Meridian?" David said, "I don't know, Dad. I don't know. Let me look." He was already pulling out his phone. He was scrolling. His hands were shaking. June watched him. She looked at Walt. Walt's eyes had not left his son. David looked up. His face was, June thought, the face of a boy who had just realized the pond ice he was walking on was thin. He said, "Terence Booth is listed as an affiliate broker under Meridian LLC. He is Meridian." Silence in the room for a beat. Walt said quietly, "Why are you selling my house?" David swallowed. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the window. He looked at June. He said, "Ma'am, would you leave us alone for a minute, please?" June said, "I will not, because whatever you are about to say to your father, if it involves that house, involves me and mine also, because I am the neighbor who is fighting to keep that house from being knocked down for condos. Say it in front of both of us." David sat down. He put his head in his hands, and then he said very softly, "Dad, Ella has leukemia." Walt's whole face changed. Ella. He said her name like he had not been allowed to say it in years. Walt looked at June. He said, "June, Ella is my granddaughter. She is 7 years old." He looked at David. He said, "Since when?" David said, "Since May. She is at Children's Hospital in Boston. She's been through 2 rounds. She is going to need a bone marrow transplant. And the insurance covers some of it, Dad, but not all of it. And I lost the house in Newton in the divorce. And the new place is a rental, and I have 2 kids and 1 salary. And my wife is at the hospital with Ella 6 days a week. And I could not ask you. I could not ask you. So I thought if I could just get you into a nice facility, one of the good ones, and free up the house, then Ella could get what she needs." He was crying. His shoulders shook. He was, June thought with a distant part of her mind, a man who had not cried in a long, long time. Walt reached out his hand and put it on his son's head, the way a father puts a hand on the head of a boy of 6. He said, "David." David said, "I know, Dad, I know. I am so sorry. I am so sorry." Walt said, "David, you did not have to sell my house." David said, "Dad." Walt said, "No, David, listen to me. You did not have to sell my house because I have been paying $820 a month for the last 6 years on your mother's hospital bill, and it is nearly paid off. And I have $29,000 in the credit union that I have been saving for exactly this. For an emergency. I did not know the emergency would be Ella, but I knew there would be one." David lifted his head. His face was wet. He said, "Dad, I did not know." Walt said, "You did not ask." They looked at each other, and it was, June thought, the first honest look between them she had ever seen from the outside. Walt said, "David, get up. Come here." David got up. He came around the bed. And an old man with a fractured hip in a hospital bed pulled his 49-year-old son down into a hug and held him there for a long, long time and did not say anything else, because sometimes there is nothing to say. June stepped out into the hall. She closed the door behind her. She stood by the window at the end of the corridor, and she looked out at the parking lot in the dark, and she pressed her hand flat against the cold glass, and she cried without making any sound. She had been standing there 5 minutes when a woman she did not know walked up beside her. The woman was maybe 60, in a grey suit, with a hospital name badge that said, Elena Marks Licks. Elena Marks said, "Ma'am, are you all right?" June said, "Yes. Yes, I am." Elena Marks said, "Mrs. Hartley, is it? I'm the social worker on Mr. Ingram's case. I was hoping to speak with you and with the family together about placement options." June turned to look at her face still wet, and she said, "Mrs. Marks, there is not going to be any placement. What Mr. Ingram is going to need is a walker, a bed rail, a shower chair, and a neighbor who is going to check on him twice a day for the next 6 months. That neighbor is going to be me. I want to know what services the county provides for that." Elena Marks looked at her for a moment. Then slowly she smiled. She said, "Mrs. Hartley, come with me to my office. I have a 2-page list." The next 3 weeks were the loudest and the quietest weeks of June Hartley's life. Loud because, for the first time in 4 years, her house was full of people. Anna Kim came over on Saturday morning with a folder of research she had done overnight into Meridian Property Group and its parent company and its financing structure, and the county planning meetings where the condominium project was on the agenda. Michael Kim, who was an accountant, sat down at June's kitchen table and, together with the Kellys and June, drafted a letter to every household within a mile of Prospect Lane explaining what was happening. Kelsey Doyle came back on Sunday with her mother, a small blonde woman named Ruth, who cried when June told her Walt was going to be all right, and Ruth said, "Ma'am, when the town needs to hear about this man, I want to be the one who stands up." Priscilla Hollins came by on Monday with a legal filing under her arm to halt any sale of the property at 18 Prospect Lane. And Elena Marks came by on Tuesday with a homemaid named Danica Reyes, who was going to check on Walt 3 times a week for the first 2 months. Quiet, because in between all of this, June found herself most evenings sitting on her front porch in a wool blanket with a cat curled on her lap, watching the sun set over the empty houses at either end of her street. Biscuit had, without any discussion, moved in. She spent her days going back and forth between Walt's porch and June's porch, and her nights in the crook of June's arm on the couch. And June, who had lived alone since the day the paramedics carried Frank out through the front door with a sheet over his face, discovered that a house is not empty when there is something breathing beside you. On the second Wednesday, Walt came home from the hospital. It was a small parade. Michael Kim drove. Anna Kim followed in her SUV with the medical equipment they had arranged from the county loan closet. Danica Reyes was already at the house with Elena Marks. The Kellys had made a casserole. Kelsey Doyle had made bread. Ruth Doyle had made pie. June had cleaned the kitchen from top to bottom and stocked the fridge. And Priscilla Hollins had faxed the final paperwork to Terence Booth at Meridian that morning, informing him that 18 Prospect Lane was not for sale, would not be for sale, and any further correspondence should go to her office. Walt came up the front walk on a walker, slowly, with David beside him carrying his bag. When he got to the front step, Biscuit was already there, sitting exactly where she had sat on that first Tuesday in October, tail wrapped neat around her paws, staring up at him. Walt stopped. He looked down at her. He said, "Well, there you are, you strange little woman." And he bent, very carefully, with David's hand on his elbow, and he touched the top of her head with 2 fingers. Biscuit closed her eyes. Then Walt looked up at the front porch, at the people gathered there, most of whom he did not know, and his face did something June had never seen it do. She realized, with a small ache under her ribs, that Walt Ingram had not been welcomed home to anything in a long, long time. Anna Kim said, "Mr. Ingram, we are your neighbors, and we are so happy to meet you." Walt said, hoarse, Well. Inside, over casserole and Ruth Doyle's pie, sitting at his own kitchen table for the first time in nearly a month, Walt asked to speak. He said, "I have lived on this street for 43 years. When Doris and I moved in 1982, I was 35 years old, and I thought I would probably die here of very old age, with her hand in mine. That did not happen the way I planned it, but I would still, God willing, like to die here. Very old. I would like that very much. And to all of you who came into my house today to help me stay here, I want you to know something. When Doris was in her last year, and the money was going, and I was scared, she said to me one afternoon, "Walter, do you know what I have learned?" She said, "I have learned that a person's whole life is a bank account, and every kindness you do gets deposited. And you do not spend from it, you just deposit and deposit. And when you die, God pays it back to the people you love." He looked around the room, and it seems, he said quietly, that she was right. "Because I do not know most of you, but you came anyway, and that is what my Doris put in the bank for me." He looked at Kelsey Doyle. He said, "And you, sneaky one, you told them." Kelsey said, "I had to, Mr. Ingram. I am sorry. I love you, and I had to." Walt smiled. He said, "Do not tell any more. Do not." He looked at David. His son had not left his side since the parking lot at the hospital. He said, "David, tell them about Ella." David told them about Ella. By 10 o'clock that night, when June helped Walt to his bed with Danica Reyes on the other side of him, the Kellys had already offered to organize a spaghetti dinner fundraiser at the Bethel Fire Department Hall. The Kims had already offered to set up a crowdfunding page. Ruth Doyle had already made 3 phone calls to women she knew from her old church who had connections at Vermont Children's Hospital. And June, walking home in the dark under a sky full of hard, cold stars, with Biscuit trotting silently at her heel, thought about a young woman who had been dead for 3.5 years and had built the account that saved her husband, and now that might just save her granddaughter. She got home and she stood on her porch and she looked up at the stars and she said out loud, "Thank you, Doris." The wind moved in the pines. Biscuit sat down on her boot. But it was not over, because Terence Booth of Meridian Property Group did not take the facts from Priscilla Hollins as an answer. On the following Monday, David Ingram received a letter from a Boston law firm called Ackerman Reese and Doyle asserting that David, as the emergency contact and power of attorney designee on his father's medical file, had verbally accepted the offer on the property at 18 Prospect Lane on the 16th of October at 4:32 in the afternoon, in a phone call recorded for quality assurance, and that Meridian intended to enforce that agreement. David called Priscilla Hollins from Walt's living room with the letter shaking in his hand. Priscilla, on speaker, listened. Then she said, "David, did you actually accept the offer?" David said, "I had a phone call with Terence Booth on the 16th. I said, I am open to hearing what the offer is. I said, I am inclined to accept. I did not say I accept." Priscilla said, "David, do you have that call in writing anywhere?" David said, "No." He said, "Ma'am, it was a phone call. I was not thinking. I was thinking about my daughter and I was thinking about a number. I did not think I was signing a contract." Priscilla said, "David, you were not signing a contract. Even if you had said the word yes, in Vermont, a real estate transaction requires a written signed agreement to be enforceable. This is a bluff. It is a very expensive-looking bluff, but it is a bluff. Do you know what a subpoena is?" David said, "Yes." Priscilla said, "So does Terence Booth. Sit tight. I will handle him. In the meantime, I want you to write me a sworn statement of exactly what you said and did not say in that phone call. And I want you to think very carefully about what your father wants to do with this house and this street." David hung up the phone. He looked at Walt. Walt was in the armchair by the window with a heating pad on his hip and a mug of tea in his hand. Walt said, "Well, I have not been in a fight since 1959, when I punched a boy named Alvin Brackett for calling your grandmother a rude name, but I remember how it goes." David said, "Dad." Walt said, "We fight." They fought. The County Planning Commission had a hearing scheduled for the 3rd week of November on the Meridian development, and the commission was going to vote on whether to grant a zoning variance to allow the condominium complex on a street currently zoned for single-family residential. Michael Kim, over the course of 10 evenings, prepared a 42-page presentation with maps of the block, aerial photos, traffic studies from 3 other Meridian developments in New Hampshire and Massachusetts, and a summary of exactly how Meridian had approached the elderly homeowners on Prospect Lane over the previous 18 months. Anna Kim organized a petition and got it signed by 411 residents of the surrounding neighborhoods. The Kellys reached out to a reporter at the Bennington Banner named Trevor Ochoa, who came to Walt's house on a Saturday morning with a notepad and stayed for 4 hours and left with tears in his eyes. The article ran on the front page the following Wednesday. The headline was in block capitals, "The Cat That Saved Prospect Lane." There was a picture of Walt on his porch, with Biscuit on his lap, and June standing behind him with her hand on the back of his rocking chair. The article told the whole story: the button, the receipt, the photograph, the pill lid, the key, the bracelet. It told about Meridian and about Terence Booth, and about the 7 parcels and the 120 condominiums. It told about David and about Ella. It quoted Kelsey Doyle. It quoted Ruth Doyle. It quoted Anna Kim. By Wednesday evening, the piece had been picked up by a Boston station. By Thursday afternoon, it was on the Today Show website with a headline that said, "Vermont Cat Delivers Rescue Package Over 5 Weeks." By Friday morning, Ella Ingram's medical fund page had received $12,300 in donations from strangers who had read the article and wanted to help. The Planning Commission hearing was on Tuesday. The room held 80 people. There were 130 in the parking lot. Terence Booth of Meridian Property Group, in a navy suit, stood at the podium for 11 minutes and explained the community benefits of the proposed condominium complex. Then Michael Kim stood for 18 minutes and explained the community damage. Then Anna Kim read the names of everyone on the petition. Then Kelsey Doyle stood up and told the story of the envelopes in her family's mailbox in the fall of 2009. Then Ruth Doyle stood up and told the story of the man who had bought her son's wheelchair ramp. Then June Hartley stood up. She looked out at the room. She said, "My name is June Hartley. I live at 16 Prospect Lane. I have lived there for 32 years. 4 years ago, my husband Frank died in our living room, and I did not know most of my neighbors well enough to knock on their doors. My neighbor at 18, Walter Ingram, spent 5 weeks trying to save a stranger last month without ever getting up from his kitchen floor. He did it because he had trained his life around a woman named Doris who told him to. And the cat trained itself." She looked at Terence Booth. "Mr. Booth, my street is not for sale. My street is not for sale because it is not a piece of land. It is a place where 7 front doors face each other, and once you tear that down for condominiums, you cannot put it back. That is all I have to say." She sat down. The commission voted 7-2 against the variance. Terence Booth left the meeting quickly. He was seen making a phone call in the parking lot. The following morning, Meridian Property Group withdrew its purchase offers on the 2 remaining vacant properties at 12 and 14 Prospect Lane. Priscilla Hollins had a very short and very productive phone call with Ackerman, Reese and Doyle in Boston, and the letter about the 16th of October at 4:32 in the afternoon was quietly withdrawn. The following Sunday, the spaghetti dinner at the Bethel Fire Department Hall raised $19,240 for Ella Ingram's medical fund. By the end of December, with the Today Show donations and the fundraiser and a matching gift from a non-profit in Boston that had seen the article, David and his wife had enough to cover the remaining costs of Ella's bone marrow transplant. Ella got her transplant on the 9th of January. She did well. 6 weeks later, she was home. But there is one more part of this story that has to be told, because in the middle of all of it, on a quiet afternoon in the 2nd week of December, June was over at Walt's house helping him sort through old paperwork. Danica Reyes had suggested it. Walt needed to update his own will, close out some accounts, get organized, and June was there because Walt had asked her to be. He had said, "Junebug, I do not want to do this alone." And she had said, "Of course." They were in Doris's old sewing room upstairs, which had become the room where Walt stored anything that he did not know quite what to do with. Boxes, old photo albums, a small filing cabinet in the corner. And in the bottom drawer of that filing cabinet, in a manila envelope with Walt's name on the front in Doris's careful printed hand, was a letter. Walt sat down on the edge of Doris's old sewing chair with the envelope in his lap for a long moment before he opened it. He said, "June, this is her handwriting." June said, "Do you want me to leave?" He shook his head. He said, "No, sit." He opened it. The letter was 3 pages long on the pale blue stationery Doris had used all her life. It was dated the 14th of August, 2022, 6 weeks before Doris died. Walt read it out loud in a voice that got smaller and softer as he went. "My dearest Walter," it began, "if you are reading this, then I have gone on ahead, and Biscuit has led you to this letter. She knows where it is. I have been sitting with her in this room every afternoon for a month, and I have been talking to her the way I used to talk to you before you got so quiet on me. She listens the same way you used to. She has a little wrinkle in her forehead when she's really trying to understand something. Have you noticed? I have been telling her about you. I got Biscuit at the shelter the day after your cardiologist appointment, the one in May, the one where they told us your heart was tired. Do you remember? I did not tell you where I was going that afternoon. I told you I was going to the fabric store. I went to the shelter and I stood in front of the cages and I asked the volunteer which one is the smartest. And she pointed to a little grey one in the back and she said, "Mom, that one is going to run your house." I said, "That is exactly what I need." I brought her home in a box and I let her out on the kitchen floor and she looked at you sleeping in your chair and I said to her out loud, "That is Walter. That is who I want you to look after when I am gone." I've been training her, my love. I've been teaching her the smell of your coat and the smell of your medicine and the smell of my old picture from Tahoe that lives in your wallet. I have been teaching her to bring me things from your pockets. I have been teaching her that if you ever fall down and you do not get up, she is to go next door to the nice woman at 16 who lost her husband and who does not know it yet but is going to be your best friend, and she is to bring things one at a time until someone listens. I do not know if a cat can be taught this, but my Biscuit is not a normal cat, and I have to try because I am not going to be there. I want you to promise me, Walter, if she does what I think she can do, if she brings the woman next door to your door, please let her in. Please let all of them in. I know you, Walter Ingram. I know you would sit in your armchair in that empty house for the rest of your days and pay off my hospital bill dollar by dollar and never ask a soul for a cup of sugar. I know you would rather die on the kitchen floor than admit you needed help. I am asking you, my love, please do not do that to yourself. And please do not do that to the people who love you, because they do. They will. Give Biscuit an extra scratch behind the ear when you find this. Tell her I said thank you. Tell her she is a very good cat. Tell her she did just what I asked. I love you, Walter. I have loved you for 56 years. I am not gone, my dear. I am just around the corner, and I am waiting for you. Your Doris. Walt was crying without making a sound by the time he got to the end. He was holding the pages carefully at the edges, the way you hold something that could tear. Biscuit was sitting on the top of the filing cabinet, tail wrapped neat around her paws, watching him. He said, "June." June said, "I know, Walt, I know." He said, that girl trained a cat." June said, "Walt, she trained more than the cat. She trained you too. She trained you to make yourself worth saving." He put his head down on his knees and cried for a long time. Biscuit jumped down from the filing cabinet and walked across the sewing room and put her front paws on his knees, and Walt lifted her up and held her against his shoulder the way you hold a baby. And Biscuit did not fight him, and June, who had cried in this house more times in the past 2 months than she had cried anywhere in the past 4 years, cried a little more, quietly, in the doorway. When Walt was finished, he wiped his face on his sleeve, and he looked at June, and he said, "Junebug, would you do something for me?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Would you come over for dinner on Fridays?" He said, "I am going to cook. I know how. I taught your mother how. Do not tell her I said that." He said, "I would like it if you would come and bring the cat. She is your cat now anyway." June smiled. She had not smiled quite this way since Frank was alive. She said, "Walter Ingram, she is not my cat. She is your wife's cat, and she is on loan." Walt laughed. It cracked something in his chest. It sounded like it had been in there a long time. He said, "Well, I suppose that's right. The Fridays became a thing. At first it was just June and Walt at his kitchen table with Biscuit on the 4th chair. Walt made pot roast the first Friday because it was the only thing he could stand up long enough for, and he was so proud of it that he served it on Doris's good plates. On the 2nd Friday, June brought a bottle of red wine that Frank had bought years earlier and never opened, and they toasted the 2 absent ones, and Walt said, "Well, Doris, well, Frank, we are keeping each other going." By the 4th Friday, there were 4 of them. Danica Reyes had gotten off shift at 7, and Walt had insisted she stay. By the sixth Friday, there were 7, because Kelsey and her mother Ruth and Grady had come by with a chocolate cake that Grady had helped bake, and the Kims had stopped in to drop off a book Anna had promised Walt, and Anna had ended up in the kitchen slicing bread. By the second Friday of February, the Fridays at Walt's had a small permanent core of about a dozen people, and Walt was cooking things June had not seen him cook since Doris was alive. The Kellys came over on the third Friday of February with a proposal. They said, "Walt, we would like to open your front room and our front room and the Kims' front room on a rotating basis on Friday nights to any neighbor on the block who wants to come. We are calling it Prospect Lane Fridays, and we would like your kitchen to be first." And Walt said, "Well, of course." And they did it. And the neighborhood, which the previous fall had barely known one another well enough to nod at the mailbox, became something they had not been in years, or perhaps ever. Ella came home from Boston in the last week of March. She was a small girl, 7 years old, with soft brown hair that was just growing back in after the treatments. She had a purple knit cap that her mother had made her. She had her father's washed-out blue eyes and her grandfather's cheekbones and a quiet way of watching a room that reminded June very much of Walt. Walt met her on his front porch. He was standing without his walker, holding onto the railing because he had refused to be sitting when his granddaughter arrived. David had told him to sit down twice on the way out. Walt had said, "David, I have not been able to greet this child at my door in 18 months. I will greet her at my door." When David's car pulled into the driveway, Walt did not move. Ella got out of the back seat. She looked up. She saw her grandfather, and she started to run across the yard the way 7-year-old girls run, arms out, and Walt bent, very slow, and she came right into him, and he lifted her up off the ground for the first time in nearly 2 years, and Ella pressed her face into his neck and did not say anything, because she had learned in the last year that some things you say without words. Then Ella looked down, and Biscuit was there, sitting on the porch, tail wrapped neat around her paws, watching. Ella looked at Walt. Walt said, "This is Biscuit. Your grandma got her. She is a very good cat." Ella said, "Hi, Biscuit." Biscuit walked over and pressed her forehead against Ella's shin. June, watching from the sidewalk, thought about a woman with brown hair standing in front of a lake in a red sweater in 1987, laughing into the wind. She thought about all the things one letter and one cat and one summer of training in a shelter in Bennington, Vermont, had made possible. She thought about how it was Doris, more than anyone, who was standing on that porch that afternoon. She wiped her eyes. The winter turned into spring. Walt's hip healed slowly but well. By April, he was walking to the mailbox without the walker. By May, he was walking to June's house without the cane. By June, he had started sitting out on his front porch again on the rocking chair Doris had bought him for their 40th anniversary, with Biscuit at his feet, watching the block wake up in the mornings. David and his family sold their rented place in Newton, Massachusetts, and moved back to Vermont in June. They rented a small house 4 blocks over on Grove Street because Walt had insisted, and because David had insisted, that Walt keep his own house. Ella walked to her grandfather's after school every afternoon and did her homework at his kitchen table and taught Biscuit to sit up on her back legs for a piece of turkey, which was a trick even Doris had not managed. Ella asked Walt, one afternoon in July, sitting on the porch swing with Biscuit in her lap, whether Biscuit missed her grandma. Walt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I don't think so, honey. I think she is with your grandma every day." Ella thought about that. She said, "Grandpa, do you miss Grandma?" Walt said, "Yes, I do. Every day. But I miss her a little less than I used to, because I have so many people around me now, and most of them your grandma sent." Ella said, "Biscuit sent them." Walt said, "That is what I said, honey. That is what I said." The house at 12 Prospect Lane, which Meridian had abandoned, was bought in April by a young couple from Burlington who wanted a real neighborhood for their 2 children. The house at 14 was bought in June by a retired schoolteacher from New York who had grown up in Vermont and wanted to come back. The Ortons, who had signed with Meridian in October, discovered that their deal had contained a contingency clause that had never been triggered, and Priscilla Hollins helped them get out of it, and they decided not to move to Florida after all. Mrs. Orton told June one afternoon over the fence that she had woken up one morning in November and looked at her husband and said, "Harold, I do not want to move to Florida. I want to be here for whatever this street is becoming, because I have not seen a street become anything in a long time." By late September, Prospect Lane was full again, 14 houses, 17 children between them, 4 of whom were teenagers and 1 of whom was Ella. 2 of the houses had elderly residents, and the whole block took turns checking in on them, quietly, without being asked to. On the 3rd of October, exactly 1 year to the day after the grey cat had first appeared on June Hartley's welcome mat with a small brown button between her paws, June woke up early. The morning was cold, the frost was on the grass, the wind smelled like wood smoke. She stood at her kitchen sink with a cup of coffee that she remembered for a moment to drink while it was still hot. She looked out across the low picket fence at Walt Ingram's blue house. There was a light on in the kitchen. She could see Walt at the counter, standing there in his flannel shirt tucked into brown corduroy trousers, making toast the way he did every morning now. There was a small sound at her door. She opened it. Biscuit was sitting on the welcome mat, tail wrapped neat around her paws. In her mouth was a single dry oak leaf, the color of copper, the edge of it just starting to curl. June crouched down. She said, "Well, what is this, then?" Biscuit dropped the leaf onto her palm. June looked at it. She looked at the cat. She looked across at Walt's kitchen window, where the toast was popping up, and Walt was reaching for it, and, in the same motion, waving to her the way he had started to do every morning that summer. She waved back. She sat down on her front step in her bathrobe, with the leaf in her palm, and she pulled the cat into her lap. And she remembered, suddenly and clearly, a Tuesday morning a year ago that had started exactly like this one, with the frost and the wood smoke and the coffee and a small brown button. She remembered how heavy that Tuesday had felt. She remembered thinking that Tuesdays got heavier every year, and no one had ever told her they would. She looked up at the sky. It was pale and blue and enormous. It looked, she thought, like the kind of sky Doris would have painted a watercolor of. She said, out loud, quietly, "Thank you, Doris. Thank you for the cat." The wind moved in the pines. Biscuit purred. And June Hartley, who a year ago had lived in an empty house on a quiet street on a Tuesday morning, sat down on the cold step with a cat in her lap and a leaf in her hand, and a neighbor waving at her from a kitchen window, and she stayed there until the sun came all the way up over Prospect Lane. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss another story like this. Because every one of us has a Doris in our life, and every one of us, someday, will be the person she is waiting to send help to. Take care of each other. And remember to notice the strange little visitors who show up at your door.